All right, thank you. Sorry about the small delay there. So just a heads up before I get in, there is some silliness in this talk, but hopefully you'll be able to differentiate between the silliness and the seriousness. It should be fairly easy to recognize. So first up, this is me. I sing in a choir. I work for Enable Networks, which is a fiber optic company as a systems developer. I also paint paintings and do silly Photoshop things. So, but you know, I also have done a huge amount of research looking at computer science outreach, particularly looking at diversity and gender parity and stuff like that. So here's some of the research that I'm going to be talking about in this talk. But before we get to that, I'm going to take you through the journey of how I got into computer science alongside of how I got researching this topic. So I started out in design, doing media design down in Wellington, and I did a programming paper there, and I could see how it could be really useful for my career and things, so I decided to switch, and I changed universities to Waikato University. I started out pretty confident with computers. Like, I really enjoyed playing computer games. I did like a tiny bit of tinkering, not very much, but you know, like I was the only technical person in my family really, so everything was like looking good for me. Except when I got to, by the end of first year, I wasn't really feeling confident anymore, and I couldn't really figure out why that was. I was like, I feel like I have no idea about computers, and sure, I'm learning all this new stuff, and it's more complicated than I first seemed, but I don't know, it didn't quite seem to fit quite right. So I started doing a little bit of research and reading and trying to figure out what was going wrong. And one of the things that I read was this, which is Unlocking the Clubhouse. And this is a book about women in computing, essentially. But I learned some really interesting stuff that really kind of got me thinking more about the situation in computer science. So, for example, students feel isolated as a result of their environment. So what was happening is that people, you know, in classes and stuff, you'd have some loud minorities who would essentially ask really technical questions that were not quite related to the subject, or they would correct the tutors and stuff like that. And it made people kind of feel like they didn't quite belong, and it really bred contempt culture. So thanks, Oren, for that shout out for contempt culture. But yeah, it's not because we, you know, I suck at computers. I mean, we all kind of suck at computers, but it's a work in progress. So then another one is that gender bias indoctrination happens very young. So for example, there are some studies that looked at the way that we treat infants, for example, where infants are often called, if they're female, they're softer and more distant, and boy babies are called active and you know, really spirited, yet all infants are kind of the same. Like there's no difference really. They just want to like eat and poop and like vomit everywhere. So this is like a way in which we impose gender bias, and then it kind of goes all the way through like school and everything, and it really does affect people's career choices. The other one is that the things that suck for everyone suck more for marginalized groups. So marginalized groups will have their own set of issues that will you know, inhibit their ability to learn and partake in certain aspects of societies. But the things, generally speaking, so like the loud people that would talk about things in class that weren't really related to the subjects, those are all also affecting my friends. And I found this out because I started talking to people about it. I was like, hey, how are you feeling about classes and stuff? And suddenly I realized that everyone felt like a complete imposter, and they were all very depressed, and they're like, what is going on with my life? So I started thinking, yeah, more about that. So this is essentially what I was doing, is that sharing my experiences with other people in similar situations really helped me to kind of realize that it wasn't just me and that I didn't belong in computer science, and that there are other people who are willing to help. So realizing this, I started the Computer Science Student Society and started organizing events. And I kind of targeted this at like all students in the faculty. So that way, it was kind of like looking at that idea that the problems that affect everyone are still affecting everyone, essentially. So we did a bunch of events. Here's some pictures of events, some stuff that we did. We did like the pub crawl, the cybersecurity challenge. We went rock climbing and like barbecues and LANs and all sorts of stuff, and it was really cool. And I did get like a little bit of feedback from lecturers thinking that, you know, it's really good, but it's probably just going to fizzle out and die as soon as you leave. But I'm proud to say that it's still going strong. They've also got like a new logo. Thank you. So it's actually been around for a while now, which is pretty awesome. But then I started looking at computer science outreach. So here's a picture of me talking to a class. I think I worked out that I've spoken to over 1,000 students so far at this point, which is pretty cool. And started kind of sharing my story, because I think that for a lot of people who get into computer science who are not, I guess, the majority, typically like white males, is that they kind of fall into it by accident. And so I don't really want that to happen. And the other thing is in the New Zealand schools, not all schools will teach digital technologies. Like, it wasn't taught at my school, so I didn't really know what computer science was like. Even when I enrolled, I was just reassured that there was no prior knowledge required, which is a good thing, by the way. It's really worthwhile to reassure people that they don't need any prior knowledge and that you'll kind of like help them through it. So there are some CS outreach problem areas. So perceptions is a big one. People thinking that computer science is for like nerdy computer gamers, and it's not for anyone else. Teacher professional development. So now that we're rolling out more computer science education into schools, teachers need to be able to teach it, and a lot of them have no idea what they're doing and think that their career is all over and that's it for them. But there are initiatives to improve teacher training. And the other one is collaboration between teachers and stuff like that, because the other thing that's happening with this is you're getting a whole bunch of like apps and technical support and stuff like this of people trying to create like learning materials, and there's an abundance to choose from, so by teachers talking to each other, they can kind of work through it and share which of the stuff is good. So yeah, stereotypes are a thing. So we can have a look at how these stereotypes are defined. This is a quote from one study. So if you're looking for ways to avoid being a stereotype, apparently wearing socks and sandals together is a bad idea, so don't recommend it. And that people who broke stereotypes were like this, so who had other interests. But this study in particular, what this did is they looked at university students, and which is where most studies seem to happen, is with the university students. But they had a short meeting with students, and then they had to fill out a thing saying if they would be interested in pursuing a career in computer science. So one of the students, they would all pair up, and one of the person in that pair was you know, somebody who knew they were in the study and stuff like that, and the other one didn't. So the person who knew they were in the study, so they would be fitting the stereotype or not the stereotype, depending on what sample group they were in. And then they only talked for about 2 minutes max. And then the other student was asked to assess what they thought about computer science, and then they were asked to assess what they thought about computer science 2 weeks later. And what they found is that they do form an impression, and people who fit the stereotype make computer science less appealing than people who break stereotypes. And gender doesn't actually really come into it. So a woman who appears to fit the stereotype is not as good as like a man who doesn't fit the stereotype. So it's basically like, regardless of whether you're male or female, those stereotypes still kind of exist in that way. And they did find that even after that 2-minute meeting, those impressions lasted longer than the 2-week period. So there's another thing that's called stereotype threat while we're on the topic of stereotypes. So what this is this idea where if somebody is in a situation in a group of people where the stereotype doesn't benefit them, as in they have a primarily negative stereotype, then people from that group will tend to select themselves out. They'll avoid it because they don't want to have, I guess, that social pressure or that social judgment. So what can happen in groups where it's particularly more toxic to women, they will, if they feel like they're constantly having to prove themselves, that their knowledge is good and that they deserve to be there, rather than doing that, people will just kind of like, they'll just choose something else, they'll select themselves out. But what this also says is that there are social and cultural aspects to people making decisions. It's not just about whether somebody's interested or not. Pink washing isn't cool anymore as well. So one of the studies that I looked at, they looked at outreach groups where they were targeting girls, trying to encourage them to go into computer science. And they took the critical perspective of, if you're in those groups, you're saying, hey, look, you can use this for sewing or for baking or for around the house or women's things. And taking this approach where, like here, it applies to these gender norms, that actually kind of isolates what they're doing from the rest of the industry and doesn't actually give them a good idea of what computing is actually about. So that still perpetuates the stereotypes rather than trying to break it down and actually encourage people to join in. So my next slide is of a list of subjects that are being taught in digital technologies. So if a school offers digital technologies, these are the things that it covers. So it actually covers like a huge amount. Like most of this is, I didn't have exposure to until university. So the way, when more and more schools are going to be taking this up, this will mean that university courses are going to have to change as well, because people will have more ground-based knowledge to kind of work from, and then they'll probably have to bring in some bridging courses for the people who haven't done this but still want to go into computer science. We also have it being taught in primary school level. So my flatmate actually is doing her PhD in teaching primary school kids computer science, and the best way to do that. They basically do it with computational thinking and doing activities like CS Unplugged and programming little B-bots and stuff like that, which have like really simple instruction sets. So having a look at this, I was nearing the end of my studies by this point, and I really wanted to kind of do something, like one last effort to try and help my university be more supportive of people in computer science. So I did a research project, and this was a project that I somehow managed to wrangle together. Some people at my university were like not so keen that I was doing this, but did manage to get the funding, and because it was self-directed, it kind of accidentally went from 3 months to like 7 months, but you know, I got it done in the end. And it was really cool because lots of people cared about it. So I think I had like over 20 people who wanted my research once I was done with it. And there's not many research projects that you can say that there's people who are like, you know, begging for it at the end. So that felt really cool. Here are some graphs. So one thing to note is that when students are enrolling, they're only given the options of male and female for declaring their gender, but hopefully that will change in the future. There's some people who are working from that. So if you can see over in the top right corner, that's like the whole university, and the red lines are female. So overall in the university, you have more women than men. But down the bottom there, you've got computer science. So it's like it's very skewed. It's not that, you know, women don't want to go into higher education or anything like that. There's something else that's kind of at play here. So what I did is I put together a list of things that help university. There's a couple of things on here that are possible for free and open source software groups to possibly work in with universities. So if we just go through that. So no prerequisites, like I was saying, is really good, like, because to me, I think if I wasn't reassured that I didn't need any like prior knowledge, then I don't think I would have actually changed into computer science. Allowing students to choose subjects, this is quite important because it can mean that you can do creative subjects on the side or like doing different things, or people can choose to do computer science from a different discipline that they're primarily majoring in. Working together in first year has been found to be really helpful, so working in small groups of students is really good. Doing summer research projects can give students like a taste of what research is like, and getting the idea of what working on a whole project is like, or part of a project. Students marking other students' work is good because it gives them both an opportunity to learn and talk with each other and give advice, and often the newer students will ask the older students what the subjects are like and which ones to take. Student environment is really important, so knowing like if students are feeling isolated, knowing if they're engaging in the topics, like what they think about the courses. A lot of lecturers just don't seem to really care. Social good and culturally responsive computing. So this is a point that I want to talk about a little bit more. So there's some research that kind of suggests that people don't necessarily know what computer science will lead to as a career. You know how medicine is going to help people or how engineering is going to help people, but you don't necessarily know how computer science is going to help people. So one of the ways of doing that is having projects that really show what it can be used for. Some examples that have been used looking at like humanitarian free and open source software is really cool because that's like a practical application, like some software to help with like disaster relief and stuff like that. People can really easily tell that what needs to happen, like why that's useful and stuff like that. Pair programming, which I'm going to come back to, and good course descriptions. Good course descriptions make a big difference. I had a look at the way that courses are described at my university compared to like some other universities that have really good gender parity. And our description was so vague, like you didn't really know what it was. Like no wonder I had no idea what computer science was going into it. Like it just said some stuff about like computers and the bebops and whatever. So having project descriptions for your project is really, really good. Like having good project descriptions can help people know if they do want to contribute or not, and what's it all about. And I'm also going to give a special mention to CS Unplugged, because CS Unplugged, it's activities doing computer science, like computational thinking, but away from the computer. Like for example, you might act out sorting algorithms, and you give numbers and stuff. And there's like heaps of activities, and they're good for like all ages, and it can really help internalize some quite difficult concepts in a really simple way. Another one is that mentoring is pretty cool, but it's also really difficult. So one example of a mentoring system that I came across that I'll talk about is one that was experimented with for an online mentoring system for people. This was done for girls going into STEM subjects. So the average age of the female mentees were 13.5 years, and they had a wait list for the mentoring program, which was used as a control group. This program ran for 1 year and returned promising results where knowledge of STEM jobs increased, and also knowledge of university, and intentions to pursue STEM were higher than those in the control group. And the girls' belief in their ability stayed the same or slightly increased where the control group decreased. So the control group, like their interest slowly dwindled, whereas the people who were able to have some form of mentoring, even remotely, were their increase was sustained or increased, which is really good and quite relevant for projects where people are often working remotely. So here are some of the benefits of pair programming as well. And one of the things that kind of, when I was looking at this, it kind of reminded me of some things that people have said about getting support for their pull requests and getting help to improve their code, that they learned a lot, and that a lot of these benefits seem to be fairly similar, just through talking to other people and getting support, essentially like another way of kind of mentorship or like working together on something. And maybe this could be, maybe a similar kind of idea of like working closely together with somebody could be good for if you're trying to encourage contributors to becoming maintainers. The other thing is that conferences are awesome and you have this really great sense of community, which is quite important. So I definitely did that. Like before going into computer science, before I changed, I went along to KiwiCon, which is the hacker conference in New Zealand. And I saw all these people there who were talking about these really technical things, but in such an enthusiastic way. And I just thought it was awesome. And I was like, yes, this is my crowd. Where do I go? Where do I sign up? Where's the subscribe button? I want to be in this. So knowing that they're awesome, and also kind of taking a little bit of interest in my operating systems course that I did at uni, I decided to come to Geelong, yay, for Linux conference. So I met some really cool people there, and they encouraged me to submit a talk about my research project. And then luckily I got accepted, yay, so here I am. So this is a survey that I did before giving this talk, because I kind of wanted, to get an idea of what people were doing. And this was just like a really informal survey, just kind of to get an idea of what people's thoughts were. It's very simple. These were the questions. Sorry, it's really tiny on the screen, but basically I left it as an open text box, so people could write in there whatever they wanted. My first idea was that I would collect anecdotes so I could talk about them in my talk, but then I ended up getting something like 250 responses. So, so here's a disclaimer. This is, I'm not a real statistician. This was a thing that I just did for fun. I have no idea what I'm doing. It's just like all made up, and it's all like qualitative research. So, it's, yeah, it's awesome. You're right. Exactly. So that's my imposter syndrome manifesto. So yeah, just bear that in mind. But I got lots of responses, which was really cool. See, look, 255, whoa. So just a little bit about this graph, because obviously you don't have that many contributors, proportion of contributors in real life. The way that I shared this was through Twitter, and I also shared it on a mailing list for women in technology and some Slack channels. And then it kind of got shared between people. So there is a slight bias in the sense that, yes, you've definitely got more contributors than non-contributors who responded, but there should be like a reasonable proportion of women in there as well because of the way that I shared it. So this is like some of the things that people said about some of the barriers to contributions. So people didn't say exactly these things. Some of them I kind of had to like use my empathetic powers to kind of make it, to kind of get the gist of what they were saying. So lack of direction was by far the most popular one. Like popular, not really the right word. People often, like throughout the whole thing, was I don't know where to get started. I don't know what kind of projects there are. What's the project that I care about? I have no idea. And that was quite interesting. Then I also had a look at contributors. So pretty much most people just ran into bugs and then submitted, or they needed a feature for work. Lots of people contribute as part of their job, and lots of people got in through knowing somebody or being part of some kind of groups. Then some people acknowledged barriers to getting in. There were only about like 21 respondents that said something like this, and yes, time was like a really big one. You know, it's kind of surprising, this one here, time is a lot smaller than I thought it would be, because for me that's definitely like a big barrier to actually finding it. But it turns out, you know, there's other reasons that people feel more held back rather than time. I guess it's because people are willing to make time for things, right? If they care about it. So that was pretty interesting. And then I've got some other notes that I got from the contributors section. So here we have some little stats like people got started thanks to Google Summer of Code, which is pretty cool. And there are some people who got into it through Linux CDs when they used to like give them out. So that was pretty neat. And GitHub was mentioned a whole bunch of time, and only 3 people said that they were primarily drawn to open source software development, or FOSS, I should have said FOSS there, because of freedom, essentially. So that was like their primary reason. But you did have some people who were saying, you know, it's easy, not hard, but then you've also got more people who are saying that there are barriers. So it's kind of interesting that for some people it does seem to be quite easy, and there were a couple of people who were aware of the bias, saying that it was easier for them than perhaps it was for others. So the other thing is like people really want to help out. So this is like one quote from a UX designer, is that they were actually a contributor, so they had contributed, but they were kind of not really, they still weren't sure if they were welcome or not. And I think that was pretty revealing. So what does the actual research say? This is a chart of barriers. So this is, you don't have to be able to read it, by the way, so don't try. This is something that some research group did that looked at barriers to people getting started and contributing. The red ones are socially related barriers. So as you can see, it's very complex. They found lots of different things that can trip people up along the way. But one very prominent theme was that flame wars are bad. So said a lot of people, and this isn't all of it either. Like there's a lot that says that flame wars are not good, and some of the reasons that they gave here were pretty interesting, or some of the observations that people made. For example, for women who are in a mailing list and they're witnessing a flame war, they actually get stressed, like a physical response to it, like their breathing will shorten and their heart rate increases just by witnessing it. Whereas for men, they might see it and be like, oh, that's really funny, except for when it's directed at them, in which case they get very upset. So that's kind of like quite different, just as an onlooker. The other thing that happens for people who are getting direct feedback, for men it doesn't really change their self-esteem or anything. They're just like, oh, okay, cool, I got some feedback, whatever, or I'm really mad about this feedback, or whatever it is. But generally, like, their self-esteem is not affected. Whereas for women, if they get positive feedback, then their self-esteem increases just a little bit. But if they get negative feedback, then it really plummets. So there's like a quite different aspect there. So something that I think is quite useful to bear in mind when giving feedback to people's pull requests and stuff like that, because it does affect people very differently. Women also don't like bargaining. There was a study where they looked at people buying cars, and women would rather spend the extra $1,000 than bargain to get that amount of money like shaved off their car. Like they really don't want that. There's also other cultures, like there was a talk earlier this week that looked at non-English speakers and different cultural contexts there, and some of them as well were saying that in their culture, like bargaining is not a thing that they like doing. So it's something to kind of be mindful of. But yeah, it's kind of interesting considering how prevalent flame wars are. So here are some of the things that you might see. This is a thing. Read the fucking manual is what this means for people who don't know, but I'm sure everyone here does. They've seen this before. So this is very not cool, especially since there's often poor documentation or no documentation at all. So saying like read the fucking manual doesn't make sense because there isn't one. And it goes by this whole idea that, you know, code should speak for itself. Gender is a social construct that OSS transcends. This is another thing that people commonly believe but is not true. There was a really interesting paper that I read called Patches Don't Have a Gender, which was by an anthropologist at Intel. Very interesting, definitely recommend reading it. And they talked about how there's this idea that the code should speak for itself and that gender doesn't come into it. But on the flip side, that's actually used as a way of kind of like weaponizing against people, of saying like, oh, well, just deal with it kind of thing. Like there are some pretty serious quotes in there where the author actually, their word of their research got out, and so flame wars started about their research, and they quoted the flame wars in their research. It was great. Like so much sass. And they were kind of saying like, oh, you're doing it about gender, but talking about gender is sexist in itself, you know. Like and they're like, no, it doesn't. You don't exist in like a social context bubble. There's also been other research which I'm sure, I know that was mentioned earlier in this week, which is that when it's anonymous, women's contributions tend to be accepted more frequently and the code quality is better, but when it's not anonymous, then it's really, really skewed to not accepting contributions made by users that appear to be women. So definitely not a thing that that the community is free for. And this idea of code speaks for itself, this is something that's quite problematic because you have these two ideas, which is good code works, bad code doesn't. But then you've also got beautiful experimental code, which often you know, it's more finicky, doesn't really work, but people will still like kind of see it as like, oh yeah, this amazing thing that happened. But actually what's happening here, the way that people kind of come to these conclusions is through flame wars. It's like whoever can justify their code and can shout the loudest has the good code. That's what essentially it kind of boils down to. So this is a problem for people who don't have English as a first language as well. They're not willing or they're unable to partake in that, and who wants to be faced with a massive wall of text. And not only in these flame wars is it just like to try and prove some point, but they often the person who is really like riled up is trying to get the other person to acknowledge that they were wrong as well. It's kind of bizarre. Here are some community guidelines that I came across, which I thought were quite cool as a way of discussing things, as like trying to improve like a better learning environment and like online discussions. Oh, hey, cool. Is this, do I have to do the thing? Did this computer go to sleep? Oh, okay, all right, we're good. Yay, we're back. So there's another thing in here as well to talk about where new people are coming from. So like I said earlier, more and more people are going to be learning computer science through schools. What if, in this magical world, you could have this idea where contributing was similar to working a part-time job? Like it was so normalized that you'd have kids in like high school level or early university who are partaking and learning about free and open source software and making contributions. And say, somebody comes home from school one day and they're like, oh, my pull request got rejected and I'm very sad. And the parents are like, don't worry, that happens like on your first time. That happened to me on my first pull request. Sorry. What if you kind of ended up in like a world like that? Like, it's totally possible. It could be more normalized. Like, I remember using like LibreOffice back in like high school, and I found it really clunky. Oh, and then I tried to use GIMP, which was just a bad time back then. I don't know what it's like now. But I remember being like really frustrated and the frustration kind of wanted to make me want to contribute, but at the same time, like, I didn't know anything about anything, so had no idea how to even go about that, so I frustratedly just kind of left it behind. Another thing is that some older people are starting to find it harder to get work over the age of 50. So some of them, what they're doing is they're turning to GitHub, making an anonymous account and starting to make contributions and trying to get into work that way, which is quite interesting. And there's some pretty new research about that that's just been coming out. The other thing is like people who are in countries where maybe they don't have the same amount of like work stability, but because software is quite global, it's a way of people being able to work and upskill even when there's disruption in their local environment. So the important thing about this is like try to not make assumptions and try and be like very friendly to everyone, because you don't really know where they've come from or what their circumstances are. All right, so here are some takeaways. Oh wait, the real takeaways. So you don't exist in a social bubble. Like, it's not a meritocracy. People are often having to like fight to be understood and to be taken seriously and stuff like that. So you want to really reduce the flame wars. There was an excellent talk by Deb earlier this week on managing conflict. I really recommend, if you haven't seen it, like go find it online, see the recording, because there are lots of really good points in there about developing empathy and how to try and like give like good feedback and what that means for people. So I really recommend watching that and learning how to deal with conflicts. And also having good guidelines like code and conducts and stuff like that, and also having a way to actually follow through. Having a process on breaches of code of conduct is important. Like, you can't just kind of like slap one in there. So yeah, those are the kind of things to think about. And have good documentation. Lots of people said in my survey responses that they were able to contribute because they had clear ways of doing so. For those of people who are lucky enough to find that, they found that really useful and helped them make good contributions. And welcome non-coders, because there are people who do care from like all kinds of parts of the world that do actually want to partake. And I mean, that's a really big issue. I wouldn't even know how you would necessarily get started on that. I mean, GitHub does try and like, it does have some kind of an interface, but like Git can be really hard for some people to learn, and there's all sorts of barriers to just getting started, or people don't even know what open source software and free and open source software actually means. So that's like maybe that's like the next project or space for future research. But until then, thank you for listening. Yay.